all who have joined this session virtually from various countries around the world. There is a pressing need to enhance the resilience of urban infrastructure to withstand the increasing impacts of natural hazards and to seamlessly continue the services to the urban population and risk-informed planning and operation of infrastructure. Climate change-related hydrometeorological challenges such as extreme flooding, water scarcity, and heat significantly impact crucial services and development in urban areas and thereby disproportionately affecting vulnerable populations. Today's session on financing innovative solutions for urban flood management will explore the experiences and challenges in financing urban flood management and allow us to gain insights through an interactive panel. Before we start with the panel discussion, I would like to invite on stage Mr. Amit Proti, DG CDRI, and Mr. Abbas Jha for a brief conversation on urban flood risk management. Mr. Proti brings in an extensive experience in urban planning and infrastructure resilience across multiple countries. His leadership in global resilience initiatives, including collaborations with MDBs, highlights his experience in disaster risk reduction. Mr. Jha is a practice manager, climate change and disaster risk management, South Asia region with the urban resilience and land global practice for the World Bank. He leads a global team working on infrastructure lending and technical assistance and advisory services within the World Bank. He works on cities, infrastructure finance and economics, technology, climate risk and resilience, and public policy. He has been with the World Bank since 2001, working on policy reform and development finance in a variety of countries. He earlier served as an advisor to the World Bank Executive Director for Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka. He was for 12 years a member of the Indian Administrative Service in the Government of India, in the Federal Ministry of Finance, and early in the state of Bihar. He is also the lead author of Safer Homes, Stronger Communities, a handbook for reconstructing after disasters and cities and flooding, a guide integrated urban flood risk management in 2012, and has edited, co-edited, or contributed chapters to several other publications. I will hand it over to Mr. Amit Proti to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Vasi and Abbas. It's so nice to see you. I think we've interacted briefly on and off,
Yes.
but we've actually never sat down and had a conversation.
Yes.
And I have a lot of notes here, but we were just saying, I think all of you in the room, Professor Nishikawa is there. I see people who don't need to be told why urban flooding needs to be looked at. If somebody needs to be told, then maybe we should see who that is and we'll have a separate conversation. But most of you in this room, we have one architect there. We've got Stephanie from Deltaris. Most of you have been dealing with floods either at the end of the problem of flooding or on the side of trying to address it through a variety of ways. So let's keep it an informal conversation. You've been working in this field for a very long time. I remember your book a decade ago that talked about cities and flooding, a guide to integrated urban flood risk management for the 21st century. We're already into, quarter of the century is already gone. And that showcased state-of-the-art approaches to flood risk management. What transformations have occurred since then, that was 10 years ago, and how have cities worldwide started to cope with flood adaptation?
So first of all, thanks Amit and to CDRI for this invitation. And it's a topic that's very dear to my heart because as was mentioned, in 12 years ago, my colleagues and I had done a handbook for cities and flooding. And actually, after I got this invitation, I went back and looked at the book because I'd forgotten a lot of it. And what was pleasantly surprising for me is that many of the messages still resonate, even despite more than a decade passing by. So I'll tell you what I think we got right, and then I'll tell you where we need updating. So what we got right was that first of all, we correctly anticipated the need for climate change adaptation, and that's clearly a growing risk for cities. That's number one. I think the whole issue of community engagement, we correctly highlighted that, and that still remains central in any successful integrated urban flood risk management. And the importance of multifunctional structures, where, for example, you have a park that can duplicate as a water storage area. I think that those are like central messages of the handbook, which I think still hold. Now, what has changed? In that sense, I think it's almost like the Charles Dickens best of times and worst of times. So let me start with the worst. Why am I saying it's the worst of times? Because clearly, since we wrote the book, the threat of cities and flooding in cities has grown. It has not actually gone down. You take the last decade, almost every major city in the world has had a major flood occurrence. I think just last year, the south of China was completely devastated by floods. So in a sense, the risk and the impact has only grown since we did that book. But it's the best of times because we have so many more tools to address this, and we know so much more about the problem. So let me give you a few examples of that. So things like hydraulic modeling has got much more sophisticated over the past decade. I think artificial intelligence is going to transform this area. Many of you may have seen that Google has done a flood risk model for Bihar. And it's quite interesting because they need much less topographic and bathymetric data, and they're able to make fairly accurate flood forecasts using that model. I think we're just beginning to scratch that surface. There's a lot more that artificial intelligence is going to transform in this sector. I think the second thing that is very promising is this balance between nature-based solutions and concrete. I mean, we all know that policymakers love concrete, the grey infrastructure. But in our book, I think we correctly emphasize that they need to get that right, the balance between nature-based solutions and hard infrastructure. That, I think, is becoming more and more obvious. And I think the Chinese concept of the sponge cities is a very, very good one, and it's becoming increasingly mainstream. Many cities are now adopting that sponge cities. I assume everyone knows what that is. But if you don't, it is essentially catching the water where it falls using natural means like permeable spaces, green roofs, and so on and so forth. And in fact, it has a side co-benefit, which is that heat is also a huge problem now for cities. And I think policymakers are just waking up to this enormous threat of heat. And having, these sponge cities also addresses the problem of heat. And the final point, and then I'll stop, is the ubiquity of data is also a very positive development. So the cost of, for example, satellite imagery has dropped exponentially. Drones are increasingly used in the field. And I think India is really a trailblazer in this because, as you're aware, I think about 2 years ago, they dramatically relaxed the norms for drones. And as a result, there's been an explosion of the use of drones, but also, drone providers. You see many young people sort of coming into this area. I come from Patna, which is, as you know, it's the poorest state in India, Bihar. And even in my poor state, people are getting drone pilot licenses. So that's a very good sign in my view. So,
excellent. I mean, I think, as you were speaking, I was just reflecting on a number of different things. CDRI last year launched this global probabilistic risk model, starting to just, again, data is it's getting easier to do the modeling bit. I think the challenge still is how do you interpret it for your decision makers. But I think I completely agree. AI, Google, I would love to see the confidence of that Google map to understand how real is it starting to get. And we launched with the help of the Netherlands government and Deltares and USA last year, a program looking at urban flooding and extreme heat. And because CDRI's focus is on capacity building and technical assistance, I think we're really trying to see what is the technical capacity offerings that we can prepare. And one of them could be, and I'm looking at Stephanie because she's partly responsible for helping us develop it, is on training people to use data, modeling data better. And I'll give you an example. You mentioned Sponge City, so I was a consultant with the ADB leading a flood management project, and it had a 10 hectares wetlands park, which was partly part of the flood mitigation strategy. And a 75-year-old hydrologist from Australia and a 65-year-old wetlands designer from Australia also had not spoken to each other. So the hydrologist was not using the wetlands estimation in his flood mitigation. So, I think even while NBS is starting to get important, and I see one architect, he's the designer of Big U in New York, and he's probably smiling because NBS is an excellent solution, but I think our engineers are not yet there to figure it out how to use it. So that's another opportunity for us to think about. The second question, the World Bank, along with GFDRR, has been at the forefront of integrated urban flood risk management, introducing novel analysis and design options which are different from conventional flood risk management strategies. Can you elaborate on some of these pioneer practices and provide a few examples of cities adopting them?
So I think the emphasis in the World Bank on this topic has been a couple of things that we have tried to do. One is, as you correctly said, it's integrated urban flood risk management, which means that you're not just thinking about structural measures, but non-structural measures as well. So that clearly has been a paradigm shift over the last decade or so. And I think one really key factor, which I think we still are not getting fully correct, is this whole issue of risk-based land use planning. And sort of guiding the city's growth away from high-risk areas. It's an empirical fact. There's been a lot of research that shows that the poor and the vulnerable typically settle in the most risky parts of the city. And that is something that we still have not addressed to the extent that I would have liked. So I think that's one area we could do better. But just to give you one example of a project, I don't know whether Barjor you were involved, but in Dar es Salaam we had done this risk-based land use planning, and Barjor was our lead urban specialist there. So that is one example. The other example which I could cite is the use of data and visualization tools. And since you mentioned this, getting that balance right between nature-based and gray infrastructure, I think one very valuable tool is if you can have a good visualization tool that shows policymakers the trade-offs that are made between different policy options. If you can show that visually, that's a very powerful tool. So in Jakarta, when I worked in East Asia, we did this tool called Inner Safe, which exactly did this. It gave policy makers a visual tool to see, what are the trade-offs in between different options. I think that's a very powerful tool, and I think we need to do more of that. And then finally, I would say that just the ability to use data for decision-making, sort of evidence-based decision-making, is something, again, that we are trying to do, but we need to do much more.
The Jakarta example, what was the name, sorry?
Inner Safe.
Inner Safe. So can you maybe
Yeah, so it's spelled INA and then Safe. And it was actually a partnership with USAID. And it's an open source visualization tool that allowed you to show what's the choice of different infrastructure options on flood risk. So, for example, if the 2008 floods,
I think the mic is...
If the 2008 floods happened on today's assets, which roads would be cut off, which schools would be flooded. So that kind of...
I mean, I think, technology, to me, it's still such a we haven't understood how to use it completely yet. Since you mentioned Jakarta, I remember MIT has something called Risk Lab.
Yep.
And there was an Indian student studying there who had essentially done crowdsourcing of people posting images on Twitter of flooding in areas, and he had mapped it sitting in
Exactly.
MIT in Cambridge, and the city of Jakarta, the Uber drivers in Jakarta were using that real-time mapping based on crowdsourced information to make decisions to avoid certain areas.
That's a very good point you're making. And in fact, that's another thing, open source. So that's another change that I've seen over the last decade, which is that the bank is becoming better in ensuring that everything that we produce, at the end of the day, an institution like the World Bank is funded by taxpayers. So we are a public money funded organization. So it's important that anything that we fund should be completely open in that anybody can use that. So now we are getting better at, for example, on all GIS data, that it's OpenStreetMap compatible and so on. But since you mentioned technology, I do want to make one caveat, which is that while I think technology is a very powerful solution, but it's a means to an end. Often I find that people start with the technology rather than with the problem. I think you need to start with the problem. And if you look at, for example, Indian cities, yes, technology will make a difference, but at the end of the day, Indian cities lack a chronic, needs much more investment in basic stuff like, stormwater drainage. There's no getting around that. So I think, yes, technology is a important part of it, but At the same time, we do need to invest more in.
I think you've gotten to my third and last question, because we want to set it up so that there's a panel discussion after this, is, what stormwater drains cost money? What financing avenues are available for cities to undertake integrated flood and water risk management projects? Furthermore, what are the areas which the World Bank is prioritizing, and what are some future possibilities?
So there are lots of interesting things happening in this space. But again, I want to sort of give you a very unsexy answer, which is that, and especially because since I work on climate change as well, often you find cities and even governments, national and subnational governments, talking about climate finance in a very unrealistic manner, which is that there's this supposition that there's this, billions of dollars are going to rain of grant money from climate finance. I'm sorry to break the bad news, but that's not happening. And my advice always to all the countries I work in is get your house in order. Do the things that make sense for you. So fossil fuel subsidies is a great example, right? The IMF has estimated something like $7 trillion still is given in fossil fuel subsidies. It's absolutely regressive subsidy. It benefits the rich disproportionately. Get rid of it, and that for each country, that's a substantive amount of money which you can target for the poor. That's one example. But if you come to the local government level, there are things like property tax, which is completely underutilized. And it's there are very few things that economists agree on, but I think pretty much every economist agrees that property tax is a good tax. Yeah. We should do more of that. Own source revenue for local governments. Those are the kind of things we should be focusing on. Get your house in order. But that said, there are other, very innovative instruments. I think impact-based investment is quite results-based financing. These are really good innovations. Many of you may have heard about the rhino bond, where the payment is tied to the conservation of rhinos. I think it was done in Tanzania, if I'm not mistaken, or somewhere in Africa. So I think we'll see more of those kind of results-based financing, and it's a good. And maybe the final example I would give is the space bonds in the US. So the PACE bonds fund energy efficiency investments, and essentially the upfront cost is reduced to zero. And the bond is paid off by the savings in the energy bills. So I think, in places like India, we can see much more of these kind of innovative instruments.
On that, I know the bank was trying to do land value capture
Yes.
towards maybe one or two examples there.
So unfortunately, land value capture has not really caught on the way we would have liked it to. And in fact, there are very few examples. I think Brazil is a good example where they've done it very successfully. The problem with land value capture is that you need functioning urban land markets. And again, that's a low-hanging fruit in my view. In most places, if you can just make your urban land markets work properly, I mean, the whole Alan Butto, what his book is called Order Without Design or something like that, no? But essentially what his main argument is that let urban land markets work, and it will solve many of the problems that we're talking about, including urban flood risk.
Yeah. So I know we can keep going on,
Sure.
but we were only given, actually that counter is already off a little bit. So I want to thank you. I think we will continue to reach out to you, partly because we have just embarked on this journey as CDRI, and we need all the thinking and capacity building. So whatever you can guide us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Abbas. There's a tree planted in your name.
Oh, thank you so much.
In a mangrove.
Thank you. I think the audience is already engrossed, and engaged with the discussion that has happened, and it seems a lot of things to hold on to the panel discussion. So for that, I would like to invite our moderator for the session, Dr. Stephanie Hansen, Social Inclusion and Nature-Based Solutions Specialist, Delta RES. So welcome, Stephanie. And about Dr. Stephanie Hansen is a researcher with expertise in sustainable and inclusive water climate adaptation working for Delta RES. Holding a PhD in nature-based solution implementation, she employs co-creation as a method in her work, incorporating various perspectives to ensure the development of sustainable solutions for successful implementation. Stephanie actively collaborates in co-shaping the Water as Leverage Academy in close cooperation with the Global Water as Leverage Partnership. Over to you, Dr. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Vasi, for the introduction. And welcome all at this second part of the session. Good to have you all here. Today we will be talking in a panel on financing innovative solutions for urban flood management. And before I share about what we're going to do, please, I'd like to invite the panelists who can be here in person, Ms. Parul Agarwala from UN Habitat, Professor Matthijs Bouw, Professor Saror and Irene Seaman will be online. We have Dr. John Kissy, please join us, from the Ghana government. And we have Professor Saswat from Zept University. Please join us for the panel. Please have a seat. Welcome to our online virtual participation. Yes, thank you very much already for introducing me, Vasi. I am indeed working in the space of urban water climate adaptation, and this is also how, for Deltares, a research institute in the Netherlands, and we partner together with ICDRI to develop the Urban Water Infrastructure Program. When we were doing our consultations, finance came up as an important topic to include this in this program. And this is also why I'm really happy these 2 days that ICDRI has devoted to putting finance central. We started actually already last week when we had an online masterclass on financing, and we specifically looked at the experiences from the water as leverage programs that have been developed in India, in Bangladesh, and in Indonesia. This is an approach where we look for inclusive, innovative, and sustainable solutions and also get that finance. We learned very interesting lessons, and we will have that reflection included also today in the panel. Yes, I already mentioned financing is an important issue. It's also a very complex issue. I also know that there's not a single person who knows it all, although some, as we just heard, know really a lot. But we also need the different perspectives, and that's why we have in this room people representing academia. We have Professor Bouw, who is also a designer. We have a multilateral agency. We have the government. And we have experts on finance. So very welcome. We are going to go to the panel, but I have some rules on how I do a panel. So I'm going to share it with you. First of all, we're going to listen to all of you, but I'm also very curious if you have questions for if you have questions in the public, please raise your hand, share it. Also feel free, panelists, to react on each other and to make comments. Another thing I want to say is we will have not so much time. How much time actually do we have? Because we ran a little late. Vasi, where are you? Are we till 3? Tell me, when do we stop? How much time do I have? Until 3 o'clock? Yes. Okay, perfect. That's important. And that's also to mention, this panel is a conversation starter. So we're going to also discuss how we're going to continue this conversation. We'll stop at 3. And we now start with the contributions of the panel. I have asked the panelists to start with a 2-minute pitch and where they reflect on 3 general questions. What are the challenges that they see in the field of financing innovative solutions for urban flood management? What is it that we need to learn about this? And if there's 2 things that can change, please, what would be the things that you would want to change? After that, we can have more informal conversation. And please, again, raise your hands when you think you would like to add. I'm going to start with Dr. John Kissy, Chief Executive Officer of the Ghana Hydrological Authority. Yesterday, we already had a nice conversation. You already explained to me how your city, Agra, is flooded actually frequently. Is this normal for you, or how do you look at flooding?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to ICDRI for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. So, yes, Greater Accra region and Accra city itself floods every year. We have perennial flooding. In fact, we had a very uncomfortable and embarrassing situation where someone somewhere in the Western world betted that after a particular year's flood, there was going to be another flood the following year. It was very embarrassing for us, you know. It's not because the government is doing nothing. It's not because we're doing nothing, but because of the enormity of the challenge.
Yeah.
And you can only deal with a particular section at a time. Of course, depending on how much funds you have available. So financial challenge is a big issue for us. You know, we know there is competing priorities for the government. Our economy currently is not great. We're currently working with the IMF. You know, so there's so much the government can do. Then when it comes to the issue of tackling flooding, it's not one that you generate returns. That you can say that, oh, if I invest $1 million in the next 5, 10 years, this is how much I'm going to generate in income, and I'm going to offset the investment I've made. So it's a bit difficult to get private sector money into, flooding. So what are we doing then? So the government is trying to deal with this, looking at policy approach. So the
Policy approach, you say?
policy, yes.
Yeah.
So the authority that I head up, it used to be a department under the Ministry of Works and Housing. The government decided to make it an authority to give it that autonomy to be able to engage foreign partners to look look for external sources of funding, you know, because as a department, you're only limited to what the government can provide. And that has given us the liberty and the freedom to engage partners. We engage in World Bank, we engage in Invest International, the UNDRI. We are working with them on applying the principles of resilient infrastructure. So that is giving us that leverage. Then within that same act that established the authority, the government set up the hydrological fund. And the fund has been set up to encourage private sector contribution, you know, towards addressing the challenge, because the private sector may not necessarily, you know, take a project and say we are doing it. You know, 2015 we had a big flood, and a lot of businesses closed down. You know, there was a particular stretch of road where we had car showrooms. Most of the cars were damaged because water got into the engines, and all of them have vacated a particular street. So these are some of the companies and businesses that we encourage in that, look, this is not just a government business. This is all our business. Let's do it together. So the fund has been set up to encourage private sector contribution to help tackle the flooding challenge that we have. So I'm sure my 2 minutes is up. I'll stop here. We'll pick up other issues.
When I listen to you, what I hear is that you really try to sort of not do it alone, but work with other partners, with other funds, maybe from local to global, to sort of make that change in your city.
Absolutely. So we're looking across a full range, you know, of options and a full range of sources of funding, you know, in tackling this huge challenge that we have. And it's not just the capital city, it's a challenge we have across the country.
Yeah. And if we talk about financing innovative solutions, what is it that you really think that we should learn?
I think we need to learn to work across sectors, you know, because when it floods, transport network doesn't operate. You know, when it floods, hospitals are not opened. So we really do need to learn to work across sectors. And one of the things that we are advocating is that if we are constructing a new road, don't just go in and construct a road. Do we have flood risk challenges in a particular area? Could we size our road drains much bigger, you know, to also take account of, you know, storm water, rather than just concentrating on the catchment within the road? You know, so those are sort of things. And then capacity building. I think through this conference, we've learned that there are investors looking for projects, and there are projects looking for investors. Where do they meet? So the full range, there's need for capacity building across the full range, you know, from the government, from the private sector, from the investors, for designers, for planners, everybody. We need a paradigm shift, I would say. Everybody has to think differently and approach this problem differently.
Great. And maybe as a last thing, in the coming year, what is it that you want to do? What is it where you want to make change in this coming year?
So in the coming year, I want to build capacity.
Yeah.
And I've already started that with the support of the World Bank. We engaged in a consultant to work with us to prepare my authority, the staff in my authority. I want everybody in my authority not just to be an engineer, but also to be a financial expert, because they should understand if you do not get the funds in, you do not get project. So we are going to train our staff. We're going to build a capacity. We want to understand, all the options out there, the grant and the concessionary funding, and what it takes to tap into it.
Yeah. So you're changing the system. You're changing your people so they can work and meet the needs and leverage your impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for bringing this example to the panel.
Thank you.
I move over to my next panelist. Is there anybody who wants to interrupt? And otherwise, I move on. Our next speaker is online. It is Ms. Irene Seeman. She's the co-director of the Rebel group as a financial expert. And Irene, you are based in Germany. You're now in the Philippines. You could not join us here today, I'm sorry. But very good to have you on the screen. Irene, together we organized a masterclass last week where we looked into how financing is approached in these water risk leverage programs, where we really push for an integrated, inclusive approach for developing projects. Maybe you can share with us what have been the lessons from that masterclass. And also, I tell you, my dear participants, we will make that available online. So it's also for you to look at it later. Please, Irene, share it with us.
Yes, hello everybody in the room. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I hope that the noise in the background is not bothering you too much, because I'm not only in Manila, I'm in Manila Airport, and that is actually a very noisy airport. So I apologize for the inconvenience. To your question, Stephanie, indeed, we had a great masterclass last week. It was a very active masterclass with the speakers, but also the participants really bringing up questions. So again, also the invitation now for today, please engage in the conversation. And we did talk about water as leverage. And that is an approach that is focused on looking into water, urban water challenges in a very multidisciplinary way. And that is also the biggest learning I think everybody took away, that you can create great projects if you not only look at it from a singular perspective, for example, or not only from the hydrological point of view, but that you also include social perspectives, that you include the stakeholders, that you include the economic perspective and the stakeholders, and that by that you create projects that actually have multiple benefits and solve multiple problems at the same time. So you use water as a main challenge, as the topic, to also leverage other potential in the urban context. And we saw from the different examples from Indonesia, from India, and also a bit from Colombia, they are already there right now working on it, that really a great potential lies in that multidisciplinary approach. At the same time, people were also amazed how many stakeholders it actually takes to come up with. So it is a lot of work to get to these great projects. And lastly, maybe to also go towards financing, it also is clear that having multidisciplinary projects does not make it necessarily easier to fund or finance projects. And that actually the distinction between funding and financing, and I think that's also something that Mr. Jha at the beginning was hinting at, is something that we need to learn. Because financing, so temporary money, is something that might be available, but in the end, you will have to have a source that pays for it. And it can come partially from grants, and there's more available, more and more available as well, but it also has to come from national sources. And it has to also maybe come a bit from the private sector, and I agree with Dr. Gissi as well, but that is not as easy for adaptation projects as it maybe is for mitigation projects. So these are all things that we heard previously now today, were also mentioned last week in our masterclass.
And Irene, if I may ask, because you're saying we need to learn how we finance multidisciplinary projects. This is something that we need to learn. How can we learn that? What do we need to do? What are you doing to learn this?
Yeah, usually if I look at a multidisciplinary project, but I'm an economist, so bear with me. As an economist, I usually look at the costs and benefits of an investment. The costs are usually pretty straightforward. Well, not by me. I usually work with engineers. They can tell me what something costs. And then I do look at the benefits, and I really see who is benefiting, so who's the beneficiary, and therefore also a potential source of funding. And that is an exercise that can really result in quite a big picture. Because it can also mean that you see if some of the flooding benefits are, for example, rather for businesses, then maybe there's a way to come up with a land value capture technique that was also mentioned earlier to, for example, create a business district, and partially the business district tariffs that might be there will be used to also fund the urban water flooding projects. Or if you are more in a residential area, and let's also now assume maybe an area that also has the financial capacity to contribute, if they are benefiting the most, then maybe via taxation, which we also just learned earlier is an underused concept, you can reserve some money, earmark some money for, again, the initial investments. So these are things that are still underused. And for me as an economist, looking at what are the benefits of a project and then understanding who are the beneficiaries behind it, that's the way how to get to a funding source.
It sounds like complex, but also a very needed journey. It feels as if this is an extensive practice. Do we have the tools for that?
I think with regard to tools, it is always extremely specific to the local context. Both, let's say, in which region are we in, what are the regulations in place, what are maybe also the policy reforms we first need to do something like that. It's of course very nationally or maybe even regionally specific, but also of course, what are we solving? Is it urban water flooding? Is it maybe sometimes also land subsidence? So it is not you cannot just apply a tool, a one-size-fits-all kind of tool that tells you the answer.
It doesn't exist.
But there are processes that you can use everywhere.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Irene, for your contribution. And I'm going to our next panelist, and that is Professor Matthijs Bouw, Director of design firm One Architecture and Professor at Penn University. Are you more a designer or a professor, Matthijs?
My title is I'm a professor of practice, so I think I'm more of a designer at the University of Pennsylvania than I'm a professor.
Thank you, Professor of Practice here today. Matthijs, we talk about multifunctional solutions and approaches, and I think you have some examples for us. Can you please share your story?
Yeah, I put some slides in the background, but I will not be really talking to the slides. I'll just make some general observations of maybe why I think that as designers we are in this space as well. I think with the climate crisis we need to develop a new type or a new generation of infrastructure, an infrastructure that is not only resilient, but is also a resilience infrastructure in the sense that it has these multiple benefits and help us adapt. And that's a challenge. We are in the process of undoing all the mistakes that we made in the past in how we constructed our cities, so mistakes that we're often still making. And part of that is rebalancing constructed and natural environments. But we also have to do that in a context that is highly uncertain, with limited resources, where we really need to sort of piggyback on existing infrastructures. And in that context, we try to make projects that are both bankable, financeable, as well as good projects. And sometimes people feel that these two things can be at odds. And I don't think they need to be. I think good projects are multifunctional, have multiple benefits. A lot of people have been talking about that earlier today because it's important, because that allows for multiple funding mechanisms. Another thing which helps with these multi-benefit projects in urban environments is that the placemaking that is involved helps improve value. That value can often be captured. It also helps to show real results to communities. That helps to build trust and buy-in to these type of projects, and that is also critical. Good projects, but I think also bankable projects, are community engaged. We engage the community to understand all those benefits that our projects should have, but also to get buy-in for implementation, leverage local knowledge, and in general, I think engaging communities is a risk reduction strategies. Good projects are also generative. They bring about change, and a change that goes bigger than just the project itself. We learn through them. We create a pipeline through them. The work that we did in Manhattan is now generating about $9 billion of investments already. And so they really create a pipeline. And in that, they build ideally on existing capital flows because they build on existing and planned investments. And I think a last point that I think is important for good projects, but also bankable projects, although there are real challenges there, is to have them as much as possible nature-based, because that creates much more flexibility and adaptive capacity than in constructed projects. So what do we do then as designers in that space? I think one of the things, of course, that we are good in is helping to get the imagination flowing. But I think as we are moving from constructed to nature-based projects, and to be honest, from linear to more land-based infrastructure, we really need to embed these new types of infrastructures in the urban fabric. And that makes it an absolute requirement to think systemically, to bring the social and the physical systems together, to avoid to really think from assets to systems, as Kamal Kishore talked about yesterday, also as a way to avoid maladaptation. We'd like to think that our visual tools help the process. They help get buy-in, engage stakeholders, help with this required multidisciplinary collaboration, and break the silos to be more inclusive. And of course, we structure projects such that they have these multiple benefits, which improves their benefit cost analysis, but also makes it a little bit more difficult to realize. But we do that by structuring them such that components each have a clear space, a clear timeline, a clear owner, and with that a clear funding pathway. So the project structuring is really something that we spend a lot of time on as designers, and matching all these components and matching all these elements is a real puzzle. I think I'll stop here for the sake of time and maybe start answering some of the questions that you have.
Yes, thank you, Matthijs, also for using the PowerPoint. It gives an impression of the type of work and imagination that you're doing. When I work with you and listening also to you, and you started to say we are in the process of redoing mistakes and making up for mistakes. That's what you said,
yes.
right? And every time I work with you, it feels we're making the next step in learning. I also every time see that there's so many things that we have not yet learned and we still need to learn. If you also, after these 2 days, these 2 days, what is now on top of your mind for your next learning step, also as a designer? What do you need to learn?
Oh boy. So, what I find really interesting is I come from the climate adaptation space.
Yeah.
And at this conference, we're mostly talking about disaster resilient infrastructure, which is, they're sort of separate worlds. And I think because the climate adaptation is really focused on mitigating and reducing these impacts on cities as a whole or on environments as a whole, whereas disaster resilient infrastructure, of course, does that, but really has a sort of focus on how to make sure that this infrastructure is able to withstand the impacts in themselves. And I think bringing those two worlds together and allowing, in a way, climate adaptation in the bigger sense to piggyback on the infrastructure investments is going to be an incredible challenge, but also an incredible opportunities because they are these different worlds.
If we can make that happen. Right?
Yeah, well, we're going to make that happen.
Okay, thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, I'm going to go to our next speaker, Professor Saswat, Project Director, Center of Urban Planning and Policy at CEPT Research and Development Foundation. Welcome, good to have you here. I think as all the other speakers, you also bring in huge experience. In your bio, I read 28 years. And please tell us what has been sort of if you look at it, what has been the major change you can see from your journey?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, all friends here. Also, thanks CDRI for inviting. I work as a professor with a university predominantly looking at the urban planning and habitat planning space, but we also deeply engage with national, subnational, local government, supporting them with the policies and related aspects. One of the area, when you are looking at urban flooding, besides the changing in the climatic variability rainfall, what is also changing in the urban land use. And that's the area, because if you want to really change the frequency of flood, urban flooding, also mitigate the risk of urban flooding, what we need to do, one thing immediately is to keep our urban drainage channels within the city and periphery of the city free from encumbrances. And one of the assessment we are just doing for the city where I come from in Ahmedabad, we are looking at nightlight data and other spatial data. And we look at that every year, Ahmedabad is adding close to about 15 square kilometer to the periphery. So when
the city is growing,
city is
super
peripherally
fast.
expanding. So two things are happening when we are saying urbanizing. The core is getting denser and the periphery getting expanded. Now, how to keep, if you want to really, when there is a huge demand for land, and land is often contested. So when even if you attach a risk, there would be always trade-offs. And those trade-offs will take up those land and those. So some of those land use, land value capturing tools to keep them free. For example, there are countries which use stormwater retention credit to actually compensate landowners who are actually residing on the countryside or drainage catchment. We need to actually explore those tools much more, more aggressively. Fortunately, there are two states in the country. One is in Andhra and Telangana, who are actually, come up with something called transfer of development rights, which is ecologically green TDR. In the city of Ahmedabad, there is a financing tool for heritage conservation.
Okay.
So those kind of innovative financial mechanism, which is land-based, and also one of the previous speakers just mentioned, that we have to also deeply look at the municipality's own revenues. How to augment those revenues, how those stormwater, retention credit kind of mechanism to finance infrastructure.
Are you saying we have the tools? Is that what you're saying?
Surprisingly, when we were working in the two states of Odisha, Tamil Nadu and Telangana, we realized this is part of our regulatory framework, which is we call town planning and urban development, which allows to play around certain kind of these tools which compensate the landowner in the periphery. So we need to, if you're looking at innovative financial mechanism, and as you know that Indian cities are underinvested infrastructure-wise, there is a huge gap between the supply and demand. One area, I think in an August gathering like this, to finance the climate risk mitigation is to look at more aggressively about the land use and land value capturing tools for risk mitigation. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for highlighting that story. And you also work as a professor at the university, and you explained also to me that you're an important advisor for different cities, and that you are in the process of advising them to make that change. Can you tell me what is the most important topic that you are advising now on, or maybe that you want to advise on?
So one of the major area that we are trying to advise to the city is how do you integrate the land use and infrastructure at the city level? Because in India, whenever we are looking at infrastructure, it is very DPR driven, which is called detail engineering project.
Engineering driven,
the planning of infrastructure is not there. So even, cities are underinvested, but if you go to any Indian city, you will not find a ready city infrastructure investment pipeline, which is related to their short-term, mid-term, and long-term needs. It is always generally a firefighting needs, which is collected hurriedly. So that's what we are actually trying to focus, that if you want to really build resilience. One of the area beside the land use and land related financing tool, you also start developing a city level investment pipeline where the cities have actually outlined their strategic priorities for today or tomorrow and also future, because
So
some
from-
of the,
yeah.
some of the climatic risk is in long term and it's generally not visualized by the city government in their day-to-day priority.
So vision, long-term,
Yes,
and also I hear you say beyond only the engineering.
yes.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your contribution. And we have two more speakers sitting next to me. Parol, representing UN Habitat Multilateral Agency. Welcome to, very good to have you here. I also asked you in the beginning, and actually to all panelists, you come here to join our panel. What is on top of your mind that you want to learn also in this panel? What are you looking for in the topic?
No, thanks, Stephanie. I know lots been already covered by all the esteemed delegates here. I think one aspect that I feel we need to approach and we need to emphasize is this infrastructure life cycle approach to financing. When we look at the different phases of financing, from planning, implementation, and the management of the infrastructure development, I feel that there is a need to look at the different financing tools and the technical tools that would be, or the combination of these that would vary across these phases. So for instance, if we look at the implementation phase of infrastructure financing, where a city, and we have prepared such plans for cities in India and across, outside in other countries also. So to give an example, to pick an example on the implementation of a city that is looking at a multi-scalar approach to urban flooding through investments in sustainable urban drainage systems. Of course, they will look at city-level capital investment plans, which would bring together the different tools, different financing options that are coming from loans, grants, and so on. But on the other hand of that end of that spectrum is also the investments that the city can mobilize by engaging local partners, communities, developers, private sector that would be keen on bringing in funds from their own pockets, from private sector at the block and plot level. So I feel like so again a need to look at multiple financing options, multiple technical tools towards this end. And so that again going back to underscoring the point on how to make communities and private sector stakeholders bring them in project planning and project design and give them more substantive and more robust roles in development of the infrastructure throughout its life cycle.
And then you talk specifically about the communities.
Specifically, so yes, so again to illustrate through a point, we have implemented a project in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, where the focus was on 6-7 settlements in the outskirts, focusing on the migrant, the population, and while through the adaptation fund, which gave $4 million, dollars. Investments were made by engaging communities in the network infrastructure of storm drainage, but by engaging communities through the formation of city or community development committees and bringing them together and developing climate action plans or their community action plans. One area that they identified was health related, and the plan then identified the need to invest in flood resilient sanitation, toilets. Now, the overall impact of this project was that 3 years down the line, post implementation, not only did those communities have less damage from subsequent flooding, but then also it reduced the disease impact by 30%. So I think when we look at value for money analysis, for instance, in infrastructure combination, I think multi-scalar, multi-sectoral, and engaging communities is very
just
important.
to check with you, do we involve communities enough in these plans?
So my learning, again, I'm speaking from a lived experience. It varies a lot, but from having worked in New York and in Afghanistan also, and in India, I feel cities, no matter what the development context is, wherever they have been able to formalize community partnerships, the on-ground transformation has been more long-term, more sustainable. The challenge is the having the patience to build that trust, to formalize those networks.
But the results are needed,
yes.
I would say. Thank you so much, Pavel, for adding that to the conversation. And we go to our last panelist, Dr. Mustafa Saror. Very good to have you here online. I'm sorry you could not join us here in Delhi. You're a professor at Kulna University in Bangladesh and now based in New York. Professor Saror, you have also been involved in the Water as Leverage program. You explained also to me how that impacted a way of looking at water in Kulna. Maybe you can share with us what changed in Kulna through that program. And we do not hear Professor Saror. We don't hear you. Oh, can you unmute?
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, I hear you.
Good afternoon to everyone. A lot of issues covered by previous speaker. Being a tail order batsman, it's hard to avoid duplication. Anyway, first of all, regarding the financing of the project, I must say that one of the issue I find that we fail to design appropriately the project, either appropriate type of the project, appropriate scale of the project. Because if I reflect on developing country perspective or global south perspective, you will see many projects go for directly designing without being feasibility study, forget about pre-feasibility study. So apparently they come up with solution before diagnosis of the problem. So it really render wastage of resource. Sometimes they try to put everything in a single size shoe. So as you mentioned that one, water as leverage, I was engaged with my team, and one of the important aspect I find that, although I saw Irene covered, that is, it is an integrated approach, not looking in a compartmentalized way or looking in a standalone way. Also, not looking only the low-hanging fruit. So we try to have a big picture and follow a programmatic approach rather than a project-based approach. So after this water as leverage approach, we find that urban area experiencing flooding. Maybe it is due to extreme rainfall, maybe it is due to wave surge, maybe it is due to uh, upland flow coming from the upper Caspian, or drainage blocking, or a combination. So there is a need for specific kind of intervention. But what we see, whenever it comes, drainage problem, flood-related problem, always they look for hard solution, engineered solution.
Yeah.
That could be numerous way of addressing. So main point, if you design a bad project, you cannot expect it will be a bankable project. If you design a wrong project, you cannot expect, other than the government, any third party will come to be on board. Forget about the private financier, because private financier need a sound project that is bankable project, so that ultimately community benefit. So my point is, financing never been easy task in anywhere, but the main point is project need to be sound. Appropriately project has to be identified, has to be designed, and then has to be implemented.
And does that mean for you that we need to sort of much more focus on these ideation of ideas and understanding the challenges? Is that where our focus should be more?
Sorry, can you repeat the last point?
It's what you're saying, that we should focus more on the very first phases where we start to understand the challenges, think about the solution. Is that where our focus should be more?
Exactly. I mean, identify the problem first, diagnose the problem first, then come up with solution. Don't just presume that this is the only solution. A problem might have multiple dimensions. Looking into each dimension and opportunity, then we have to devise the whole program and then come up with bankable project for different time scale, for different spatial scale, not a single shot. For example, in UAL, we come up with not only drainage component, not only creation of water reservoir, we come up with policy instrument as well. As Professor mentioned, that for the new urban area, 40% of the plot need to be kept vacant so that water can be percolated, percolation of water could be allowed. It will reduce amount of pressure on the water drainage system, peak pressure, because no city can design its drainage system considering the peak flow or peak design capacity.
Thank you so much for adding that point, Professor Saror, and also for waking up very early in New York and for making your contribution. On my clock here, I have a big clock, you don't see it, I have 2 minutes to finish this panel. And as I mentioned, this is a conversation starter. We will continue to work with the Urban Water Infrastructure Resilience Program with CDRI, and I would like to continue our conversations. Please, panel, very shortly, how can we continue our conversation? On what topic should we continue with? Please, I start here, I go just to finish the round. On what topic would you like to continue our conversation?
I think I would like to pick up on this capacity building aspect and trying to break the silo of practitioners on hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure. I think we need to really move towards hybrid infrastructure, where nature-based solutions are not perceived as soft, and not taken as seriously as pouring concrete. For that, we need to make sure that our practitioners, coming out from the academic institutions all the way, who are sitting in positions of power.
We can continue that conversation. Please, Dr. Kissi, where do we continue our conversation on?
Yeah, I think we should look beyond risk and see opportunities.
Perfect. We look at the opportunities. Professor Stasveld, how we continue our conversation?
I think we should continue conversing on land use and infrastructure and explore tools for financing infrastructure resilience.
Thank you. Matthijs, what topic do we continue our conversation?
I think we should bite our teeth into a real concrete project.
Concrete project,
and try to bring in everyone from the outset and really develop that systemic view and make sure that in the project there are enough resources to go beyond the silos and make the necessary connections between the different parts of a project, both the social dimension as well as the physical dimension.
And I'm asking, I'm sorry for the question. I asked for what do we continue the conversation of, but are you telling me we're not doing conversation, we need to do some things?
So I think working through problems, just putting in the sweat is the best way to learn. And so that's why I'm also so happy with my profession, that I can do projects.
Thank you for that addition. Irene, how do we continue our conversation?
Well, as I said earlier, I think we need to continue the conversation both on financing, but also especially funding and learning maybe the difference and the interaction between the two.
Perfect, let's do that. Professor Saror, how do we continue our conversation? It feels we just started.
By continuation, I would say no standalone project.
No
Look
standalone
at the big picture and set accordingly. You will move.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My dear panel, thank you very much for adding your stories, adding your experiences to this field. And as I tell you, we already started, we start again today, and we are continuing this conversation. So thank you so much. Please give them a big hand. And enjoy the rest of the day in conference.
I would request the panel to be on stage. And I would like to call on stage Dr. Mahesh Rajasekar to give the tree certificates. Matthijs. And also call Sir Mr. Abbas Jha and Mr. Amit Proti on stage for a group photograph also. And please, along with that, Noni, Nishi, can you join us also? And Sarga, is she here? Noni, please join us on stage.
Selfie, you have to take selfie.
Just one wait. We have our youngest team member there. We'll try. Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's great that we could have Professor Sarwar and Irene on the photograph too. So thank you, Professor Sarwar and Irene, and we look forward to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.